Matthew Gregory, how are we?
Hey Tim, great to see you again.
Yeah, gosh, we're on podcast number 8 already. We did growth mindset last time, number 7, which I must admit I enjoyed that. And we're on to a topic which, I'll be honest, I think everybody has an issue with this. You know how with our model, there's certain areas where people kind of have maybe, strengths and areas of development. This is one I think for everybody I know, areas to development, right? Including myself, right? So,
Yeah.
And it's using boundaries. So how we manage boundaries well and healthily so we can actually maintain our resilience. So why is this such a big issue, Matt?
Well, I think it's become a much bigger issue, and not just for people out there, for me, I know for you, almost everybody, because the pandemic has had the effect of destroying the normal boundaries that really helped us to kind of separate work from non-work. But of course now, people have been working from home, often working in the same space where a bit later in the day they'll be eating or mixing with family. So that's one boundary that's been destroyed. I mean, another one is time. So whereas historically you would go to work and then you would come back from work and it was separated by this commute, this transition, again, that boundary has gone. And thirdly, whereas historically the separation between family and work was quite clear, and it was only in occasional points in the year, maybe Christmas parties when kids were invited, that the two would merge. With the pandemic, we've seen that merging with a lot of homeschooling and often kids coming onto webcams in meetings. And so that's another boundary that has just been destroyed. And what people say is, energetically, is that has had a huge cost for them. So that's why this is a big deal.
I really like the context you put for that. I was kind of scanning each time you said, about to have dinner, tick, time boundary, tick, and I kind of felt when you were describing that, just how it was applying to me. And I thought I was pretty good at doing boundary stuff. So it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think it sounds like basically our boundaries have really shifted since the pandemic, which has brought to light maybe an issue that we've always had, but now it's particularly acute.
Yes, and I mean, to your point about we've always had it, there's a great article called Set Better Boundaries, a Harvard article, published in 2021, and it talks about the fact that boundary predators are easy to find at work. And I love that because, I mean, that isn't something that's changed because of the pandemic. You've always had boundary predators, people that are just testing and poking and taking liberties, to be quite blunt, with your boundaries. And if you don't do something about it, if you don't manage those boundary predators, it can just have a huge cost on you in terms of recharging, in terms of that sense of having a separation between work and non-work. And that can be very costly.
I know you're going to share, tons of stuff on this, which I'm looking forward to, but I'm just curious. I've got one thing in mind. How do we know, that our boundaries are being kind of violated? You talk about boundary predators. What's the signals? Because I think, I'm really curious about that.
Well, I mean, some of the examples they give in that article, which I really liked, is you're just about to walk out of the office or just sort of shutting down, and typically it's somebody with more power than you makes an unreasonable request, and almost the subtext is, I am more powerful, so it's going to be difficult for you to decline this request, which is really a boundary infringement. I mean, I saw it at KPMG when I worked there a lot, and I'd perhaps be sat near somebody who said, I'm really looking forward to this evening. I'm taking my spouse to the theatre. We've got a really nice meal planned. And then about 4:30, a big, powerful person, typically a partner, would wander to that person's desk. And because of perhaps their poor planning, they'd say, hey, we really urgently need this piece of research for this deal. And I need it for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And like, this is like a 4-hour piece of work. So suddenly this person's got a choice. Do I stand up to this powerful person, or do I allow them to infringe this boundary? And suddenly I've then got to let my spouse down.
Yeah.
And we're all constantly getting little tests and violations like that. And of course, it's not just at work. It happens at home as well. You agree with the people you're living with that they're going to do certain tasks and you'll do certain tasks. It might be emptying the dishwasher. It's their turn to do it. You get up in the morning, about to go to an urgent meeting, and you realise they haven't emptied the dishwasher. Hang on, we agreed. That was something that they were going to do. They said it last time. Of course, it may have happened, but the fact is, and they've gone off to work. So it's like they're just leaving you with that problem.
I'm left with this kind of almost this imaginary line, right? Which is, you kind of think you've been clear with somebody and you've got this line in your head and they've got no idea, right? It's just coming back with who they are, right? And then it's like, what, you violated? So it's a really interesting sort of demarcation, isn't it? That needs to kind of be considered. I mean, how do you know it's unreasonable? I thought that's a really interesting. What's unreasonable?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, Tim, because there's a lot of assumptions that people can make about what is unreasonable. So that in that first example I gave, with somebody making a request of somebody that was going to take 4 hours and they were making it just as the working day was coming to a close, their assumption may have been, well, that's what you do. As a junior person,
might be reasonable to them, as you say.
So part of managing boundaries, and we'll come on to talk about this, is a lot of it is about communicating, agreeing, negotiating, because there's some boundaries that you can unilaterally enforce. There's others that involve other people, and you need to talk about it. And even if you do have the unilateral power to set a boundary, you still may need to communicate it to people that are affected. So to your point about what's reasonable and unreasonable, it starts to get a bit blurry and confusing, which is why it's quite a difficult territory to navigate, because it's not straightforward.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, where's the guidebook when you're growing up? Or, I'm thinking about my kind of experience. Now, I had nobody telling me about this stuff. It's just like, I just was like, yes, do, perform, and, and almost please, which to get a certain level. And then when you get a bit more senior, it's like, okay, I need to have some boundaries in here. And I need to, otherwise I'm going to go crazy and allow all this craziness in.
Well, I think to your point about sort of growing up and, where's the guidebook? I mean, often our families are some of those boundary predators. Who don't respect our boundaries as children, as teenagers. Maybe they're too intrusive. They have an unreasonable level of control, which they expect to exert, which violates our free will. So I agree. It's a complicated territory.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, so how about a little bit of research? Because we try to be research driven on this. I mean, have you managed to find any research on boundaries at all?
I have found some, but I'll be honest, the research, particularly since the pandemic, it's still coming out. It's slowly being published. One piece of research that I came across literally 2 weekends ago, it was published on February 19th. It was, and this particular piece of research was looking at Britons. So I appreciate it's just one country, aged between 50 and 65. And what it was saying was that more of that age category have left the workforce. In fact, it was 250,000 people in that age category have left the workforce since the pandemic. Now, that isn't all because of boundary management. When you start to dig into that particular research, it's talking about the psychological and emotional burnout that they've experienced because of the pandemic. However, one of the big contributory factors around that is the blurring of boundaries, which has affected them. In fact, one of the people, Tim, that's done a huge amount of research around patterns of working is Linda Grattan from the London Business School. And what she talks about in an article that she wrote for Sloan MIT Management Review is that, I mean, she said this: what these intensive home-based ways of working are revealing with absolute clarity is something psychologists have known for some time. Boundaries matter.
Yeah.
And that was published in 2020.
I keep on going back to when I first started realizing how unhealthy this area is a long time ago, right? Kind of in my kind of late 20s, early 30s, the ability to say no was really important. I remember kind of, having managers above me saying, you've got to learn how to say no, you're taking on too much. And I would just hoover up stuff. That was the first time I ever came up to this. And then fast forward to my own kind of, personal journey on this, where, basically when I hit the wall, I had no boundaries. My boundaries are just completely gone. And then I kind of, got pulled under on that. So you talked about sort of the effect of this. I mean, I'm maybe being a bit dramatic with my own, output on this, but what's some of the real issues that we can have if we struggle to manage our boundaries here?
Well, a big one is it can seriously affect our ability to recharge, which of course is the title of our book. Because if you don't have protected time when you are not working and you've effectively said work is finished, and you are doing other things which help you to regenerate, the risk with a lot of people is work bleeds into that time. And you never fully switch off. And that affects your ability to sleep. It can affect your ability to recharge, to be fully present in those out of work situations. And all of that gradually starts to take a toll on your sense of energy and vitality. The second thing, to your point, which is if you don't have the skills, the courage, because it does take courage to set boundaries and enforce them, then it can give you a sense of powerlessness and just being a bit adrift by other people's demands. In fact, one of the people we quote in our book, Chris Valentin, says, if you don't set boundaries for yourself, other people will.
I mean, it's this is the whole point. I mean, this is not easy stuff, and it's also pretty unpopular. When you set a boundary, it doesn't tend to please people. It tends to kind of go, it tends to almost trigger them sometimes, right? So how can we have kind of courage to do that when it sometimes can be, pushback can be severe sometimes?
Yeah, well, this overlaps very much with the ability to have what we call in the book courageous conversations, which is the topic for another kind of podcast and blog that we'll be publishing, because there's two dimensions to this. One is, first of all, accepting that you do have the power to set a boundary. Now, some of those, as I was saying earlier, you need to negotiate. You can't just, set them unilaterally. Some you can, but a lot, if they involve other people, like your partner who you live with, colleagues at work, like if you decide, I'm not going to handle emails after a certain time, I'm not going to handle work calls, at particular times in the day, for instance, so you can protect time for serious thinking, you need to let them know, and that may have an implication on them. So it may be that you need to negotiate it. So step one is setting a boundary. But as we all know, particularly if you've got kids, you can set a boundary But then there's a second big territory that you alluded to, which is you need to enforce it.
Yeah.
And that's where boundary predators that we talked about earlier at work, they'll be testing that boundary. You might say, I'm not going to work over the weekend.
Yeah.
You know, for instance, I need my recovery time. I need time to, I've promised to my family I'm going to be with them for one full day over the weekend where I do no work and I'm fully available to them.
Yeah.
And there's going to be somebody at work, often a powerful person, that will say, look, I know you said that. I know you've agreed it with us. This situation is special.
Yeah.
Justice
once. In this case, ignore. Yeah.
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 And it may be, I mean, this is the challenge. I mean, which is actually, it may be a really special situation. It may be a mission critical issue, and they do need your specialist input. But of course, the risk is once you do it once, unless you, in the way that you do it, you reset the boundary, the risk is that boundary has suddenly become quite fuzzy or leaky. I mean, psychologists talk about leaky or porous boundaries.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating because I mean, where I'm going with what I'm hearing you say is almost there's two areas here. There's the home and the work. And I'm talking home, friends as well, social. And in work, we, in a way, organizations who have clear ways of working, clear values, articulate their values clearly, they're going to find it a bit easier to navigate this because there's kind of almost rules of engagement there, right? Yeah. Whereas, if there's no rules of engagement, then you're at the massive kind of, just as you say, senior level win, right? And then at home, it's like, it's a bit different because it's okay. How do you then set up your own home and social life too? So, how can we get practical with this? I'm starting to get practical in my head. How can we get practical and get healthy with this stuff?
Well, so, I mean, being really practical about this, I think the first practical piece of advice that we would give to people is you need to recognize and accept that you have the power, and it's completely reasonable to set or talk about setting certain boundaries. If you don't accept that, then anything else is going to be building on a very flaky foundation.
So you're talking about, can I just clarify, you're talking about the why. So you need to say why you're setting a boundary.
Well, I think I'm even going deeper than that, Tim. I'm saying accepting to yourself and acknowledging to yourself that it is okay for me to set a boundary, and how people will set them for me. So it's part of accepting and embracing your power as a person. And if you don't do that, if you don't realize and accept that, then everything else we talk about is just going to be tactical, and it will be ineffective. Because as soon as somebody challenges you, then it's likely that you will cave in, or it's possible you might. And then, so as I was saying, that there are some boundaries that you can set unilaterally. For example, I know a lot of people that have set boundaries around the kind of food they will and won't eat, because they realise it affects them in certain ways that, some of it's positive, some of it's negative. If the boundary involves other people, then you start to need to have conversations. So if I give you a practical example, Tim, if that would help. Let's just say, like one of those people I quoted in the research from earlier from the Times from a couple of weeks ago, you're realizing that you are starting to feel continually exhausted. And you go to the doctor and they run a load of tests, and the doctor says, unless you start taking much better care of yourself, resting more, working less intensively, you're on a road to burnout. And that's going to have much more serious health consequences for you. And it scares you. Because you've kind of known this energetic decline is happening, and you realize I need to do something. So it might be, for example, you realize I need to sleep more. I need to socialize less. I need to work less intensively. So it's if you've got a family, then the first two, sleeping more, socializing less, it may be that you need to have conversations with people in your family and explain the situation and the fact that you can't go out and do as much as you were doing. You need to go to bed earlier. You need to sleep better. That means certain things need to change in terms of your pre-bedtime routine. That's going to affect the people you live with, and you need to agree that with them. For example, if you go to bed at 10 o'clock, but your partner's coming to bed at midnight, waking you up just at the point where you're in that deep regenerative sleep, that's a problem. So that it may be you need to have conversations with colleagues at work about who are going to be impacted by you working less intensively and being less available. You need to discuss and agree and negotiate that. And as soon as you set a boundary, as I was saying earlier, there's going to be people that challenge it, either unconsciously or consciously. And you're going to need to have conversations with people when they start to challenge those boundaries and violate them and do something that is different to what you've agreed, which is it's going to happen. I mean, another question that people can usefully ask themselves, Tim, is to think about how healthy are their boundaries. And one of the things we often do on programs, which you'll be aware of because you've been with me when we've been doing it, is we will perhaps encourage leaders or professionals to look at an issue that's causing them a lot of frustration, a lot of angst, maybe it's costing them a lot, and to look at it through the lens of boundaries and to ask themselves, are my boundaries too porous, too inconsistent in this area, and is that the source of some of the problems that this issue is generating for me? Another question that we ask people to consider, and I think it's a really helpful thing to do on a regular basis, is to actually ask yourself, are there any areas in my life where setting clearer limits would help me in managing my energy levels? So, for example, I mean, just very personally, I know recently I've been experimenting with reducing and setting more boundaries around the amount of TV I watch and also the type of TV I watch. Because I realised that I mean, whilst it's a little bit interesting watching an hour on someone's dysfunction that's been turned into a documentary, actually doing it repeatedly is something I was finding. It was like, this is not energizing me, this is actually costing me. And I'm not talking about being a hermit, but so I've set some boundaries around it. And that was one where I had to talk to my wife about it, because she really enjoyed those kind of programs and finds them very energizing. And often we'll watch TV together, so that she wants to watch that, and I've kind of made it quite clear to her, I'm not going to watch that kind of TV. So if you really want to watch it, I'll go into another room. And I'll be honest, that has helped me to sleep better, and that's giving me more energy. I would also say, just finally, there are some really practical decisions that it can help people to make. And one of those, broadly, there's a HBR article published in 2020 called "How to Leave Work at Work," and which is a bit. I mean, this is a big issue when it, in terms of boundaries, where people let things kind of get a bit fuzzy, is to kind of make some decisions about what is after hours for you. And it's not saying you'll never work after hours, whatever you set that to be, but it might be there needs to be certain special situations. And I'm always wary when I'm saying that, because the risk is you can make every situation, oh, this is special, this is an exception. Next thing you know, the boundary is non-existent.
Those are great questions to really consider. I mean, I think it's ongoing work we need to do in this area. It's not like a one-off. You constantly need to kind of review, right? And what I'm realizing, because it takes quite a bit of self-awareness to self-assess it. So doing it with other whether it's your team, your partner, your colleague, whatever it is. I think that's probably where massive value is as well, isn't it?
Huge. And I think you raised a really good point there, Tim, which is when you do this at the level of the team, with teams, with colleagues, it is so much easier to set boundaries than when you're fighting the entire organizational system.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of the work we do is actually with teams, because we know that when teams agree on things like this, it suddenly becomes much, much easier.
I completely agree. I think almost sort of the key here is to have, a group agreement on boundaries. So there's almost like, it's a lot more overt rather than individual expectations that aren't really spoken about, that can get violated the whole time because we're all different, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yes, completely agree.
Okay, so I guess any reflections then on sort of this, because you've given some real practical questions we can have. What are the reflections on how we move forward with this?
So a couple of things. I'm going to put all of these questions, these self-reflection questions, into the show notes. And what I would encourage people to do that are interested in this is to take a look at those and to make some time, if it's of interest, to actually think through those questions. Maybe, as you were saying, to talk to colleagues about it, and maybe to get their reaction. Because one of the things that I think is really interesting in this field is we often get an instinctive sense of people around us about how good they are at setting and then also managing boundaries. And I'm sure we can all think of people that we would classify as soft touches.
Or who haven't got boundaries.
Yeah. And guess what? You want something done, often just because it's an easier door to open, you'll go to that person. So I think assessing, using some of the questions we're going to put in the show notes, could be a really useful thing to do. I mean, if this is something that's particularly of interest, then taking a look at the book, where we not only talk about boundaries and how to manage them, but also there's a whole section on how do you have those conversations, particularly with powerful people, in a way that doesn't get you fired or isn't going to damage your career.
Yeah, because you want to be able to put those on the table, right? And in a way, as you say, that doesn't really jeopardize.
Yeah. So check out those chapters in the book.
Yeah, thank you.
Actions.
Thank you. I think that's great advice. I mean, I think where I'm left at is I realize I need to have more conversations with those people. You included, right? You and I work together. So where we're kind of saying, how are we doing with our boundary management? Is it working? What's working? And I think I'm realizing, like, a collective, as in other, whether it's a team, a partnership, or group, is a really powerful way of moving forward. So thanks for sharing that. It's really opened my eyes today. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for this podcast. And I guess we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.